So we're about to continue on page 45. Hopefully this week we'll finally finish chapter 2 and chapter 3. That way we'll be up to date, and we'll try to keep to a schedule of a chapter a week. So far we haven't been so successful. But for now, I want to just summarize where we are. Yes, that's for you. I want to summarize where we are and why we're doing it. So the generally speaking, if we think about what Tanya is a book, a guide for us as we deal with and as we struggle through the daily struggles of life, and as we strive to grow and become better people, especially now in the final days of the year. Everyone's looking at the new year and wanting to be the best version possible for the next year. And so when we look and when we want to become better, the Tanya is the guide that helps us achieve that. So in order to beat the struggle, in order to really understand, in order to really become the best version of what we could be, we have to understand what we are. And we by understanding what makes us tick and what makes us the people that we are, that will help us achieve our goal of becoming the best version that we could be. To that end, the Alter Rebbe starts very, very basically. At the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, he introduces us to the doctrine of the two souls, telling us that every single Jewish person has two souls. One, quote-unquote, animal soul, the nefesh habahamis, or as we like to call it, the natural soul, the instinct soul, the selfish, just the natural pull to what our body naturally wants.
Do we call it the physical soul?
So physical is a word that will get us in trouble because it's not physical, right? It's attracted to physicality as opposed to godliness, but the soul itself is still not physical. But the natural soul, right, it just follows its natural tendencies. And at the beginning of chapter 2, we have the godly soul. These two souls are not just two different, two different voices in our head. These are two completely different operating systems. And in our life, when we switch from doing something because we naturally want it, whether it's good or bad, but if we do something, whether it's something as neutral as taking a drink of water or sitting down or standing up, whatever it is, if we're doing it because we naturally want to do it, we're doing it through the power and through the garments, as we're going to discuss today, of the animal soul. When we connect to God, when we learn Torah, when we pray, when we do something positive in a spiritual sense, then we are using the operating system and the entire systems of the godly soul. Where do these souls come from? And so as we explained, the animal soul, the natural soul, comes from klippa. Klippa is the reality that covers over godliness. When we exist in this world, we don't see godliness. Why not? Because there is a shell. There is a cover over godliness, and therefore, I don't experience godliness. And that from that shell, from that covering, that is where the natural soul comes from. The godly soul, on the other hand, comes from God. It is a real piece of godliness, and it's a real slice of godliness that each one of us have within us. And that is the setup that the Alter Rebbe was getting started. At the second half of chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe goes on a little bit of a tangent. Because to really understand, when we say that the godly soul is a piece of God, we're saying it's a piece of the essence of God. Really, really, really from deep within God. As we gave the example of blowing versus talking last week. So the Alter Rebbe has a technical question. By definition, the essence of something is perfectly essential and perfectly the same no matter what you do to it, right? That's why there's a concept in Hasidic thought that if you cut off a piece of the etzem, of the essential, the etzem is the essential being. If you cut off a piece of the essential, you have the entire thing. Because as soon as you start getting to divisions and definitions and differences, that's no longer the essence, right? By definition, the essence is above differences. So the question is, how is it possible that we have different souls? As we explained, both generationally speaking, we don't have souls on the same level as Abraham, as Moses' generation. They had much higher souls than us. Within one generation, you have the head of the generation, and you have the feet of the generation. You have the foot soldiers. Those two souls are not at the same level. And even within ourselves, the word soul is used as a general term. We have our higher levels. We have our nefesh, ruach, neshama. Even higher than that, we have chai, yechida, as I'm sure we'll discuss at length throughout the Tanya. But the question the Alter Rebbe poses is, how is it possible? If the soul comes from the essence, how can there be differences from an essential being? To start us off with an answer, the Alter Rebbe gave a parable, gave a metaphor of the human body, of the human development system. And I want to just take a moment because throughout the Tanya, time and time again, we're going to be using the human body or human systems or human emotions as a metaphor for godliness. And that's not accidental, as the verse says in Job, Mifsarai echze eleika. From my body I will see God. Our bodies, everything about our system was designed to mirror God. Right? When we were created in God's image, God doesn't have a beautiful face like us. What does it mean we were created in God's image? It means that our systems, our emotions, everything about us runs in a similar, obviously not mirrored. We can't really understand God. What we could understand is ourself, and we know that God's systems and God's ways of operating and God's quote-unquote emotions, etc., operate the same way that ours do. So with that in mind, last week we finished off with the metaphor of the human fetus developing. That yes, it's true, every single part of the human fetus comes from the same DNA sample, from the same drop, the same injection from the father. However, through the months of development in utero, that same drop, part of it turns into a brain, and part of it turns into a toenail. Now, it all comes from the exact same source. It all comes from the essence of that source. How do I know that? Because if you take a DNA test of the toenail and a DNA test of the brain, they'll both connect to the same place. They'll both connect you back to the Father. So with that in mind, the Alter Rebbe will now continue and give that example. How does that work with the Jewish soul? And we are on the bottom of page 45. Now apply the same model, right? So that same model means the process of the development of a fetus, although in an entirely different abstract sense, to the origin of every nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the entire Jewish people. Page 46. In English, the origin of all souls begins above as a raw, pristine sample of God's wisdom, which is one with Him. And that descends level to level through the chain of spiritual worlds, through the worlds of emanation, creation, formation, and action, as they emerge out of His wisdom. As it says, you made them all with wisdom. It is through this process of descent that the entire spectrum, page 47 on the top, of souls emerge, creating even the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the common people and those of lesser stature. So the Alter Rebbe says that yes, it's true. There are different levels in soul, but how do those differences develop? They all come from the same sample of God's wisdom. And as we explained at length last week, although we struggled to understand it, that God and His wisdom are one. So when we say we come from God's wisdom, we mean God Himself, from God's essence. Yes, that same sample of godliness created all souls, but there's a long road to get down to this world. And the Alter Rebbe references the Kabbalistic concept of the four worlds. In Hebrew, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. In English, the worlds of emanation, creation, formation, and action. And now, that's a very long discussion. For those that joined our World of Kabbalah class 2 years ago, you are a little bit more familiar, I don't know too much familiar, but a little bit more familiar with these concepts. But that is the process by which godliness, God turns into godliness, which turns into physical world. It's a very long process, and spiritually speaking, it's the way that sort of, as those worlds continue, it's becoming less creator and more creation. And that whole process. The soul travels through those worlds to come down into this physical world. And through that process, as it's rolling through those different worlds, it picks up different stains, different emotions, different attributes from these different worlds. And so therefore a higher soul will be affected much more by the higher worlds and glide right through the lower worlds. And so it's not going to be held down, it's not going to be limited by a lot of the problems and a lot of the issues that will develop if it's too contaminated by the lower worlds. So just
our soul is not moving up and down, right?
Our soul, our soul comes from God's essence, and it's down in this world. How did it get here? How did our soul get from God's essence to this world? And so the answer is, it evolved through the different worlds, through the different The same way that the godliness in general comes down from God himself down to this world in all aspects, whether it's God's blessings, whether it's the Torah, all of godliness had to evolve in order to get to this physical world. That includes the soul. And depending on what stops and what distractions and what things the soul picked up along its evolution, that's the difference of what kind of soul we are presented with and we have within ourselves. And so yes, it's true, there are different souls. And if we think about our soul versus Moses' soul, Moses' soul was much higher. Why? Well, we know from Kabbalistical teaching, Moses' soul, and his entire generation, they were souls that represented and experienced the reality of Atzilus, of a world which is pretty much all godliness. Godliness is a reality to them. That's why there are much higher souls. We, generations and generations later, don't have such high souls. And so too, from within one generation, when you look at someone and you say, I can't believe that person's also Jewish and they have the same soul as me, the answer is, the essence of their soul is the same, but they probably picked up some contaminations and some distractions along their journey. However, it's important to remember that while it's true that the final product is very different, just like in a fetus and a baby, the brain is very different from a toenail. At its essence, at its core, every single soul is connected directly back to God's essence, and it has that essence still within it. Continuing on page 47, Im kol zeh aidena kashudes u'miyachedes biyichud nifl v'atzim b'mechustim v'atzmusan rishon shehi hamshachas chachma ilah. Yet despite this metamorphosis and descent, these souls retain a wondrous, intense bond that unites them with their origin and essence and being a sampling of the higher wisdom. Now, vitally, that connection never gets severed. Continuing on page 47, Ki nikas v'chayis nefesh ruach neshama shel ami haaretz hu mi nefesh ruach neshama shel tzadikim v'chachamim rashi b'nei Yisrael shebedeira. They remain connected to their origin because this core vitality and life energy of the nefesh ruach neshama of every one of those simple people is from the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the tzaddikim and the sages, the heads of the Jewish people in their generation, just as every cell, even those within the child's toenails, is fostered by the child's brain. So, going back to our metaphor from last week, we said, how does a toenail connect back to the father? Right, the toenail that's gone through 9 months of development and evolution and devolving, you'd have to be crazy to say that that's still connected back to the father. So we said that connection happens in two ways. First of all, because the toenail at its core, deep inside, if you look at the DNA, it's still made up and it's still connected to the father. But the toenail doesn't experience that. We don't experience that, right? What do we experience? Every part of our body receives its vitality and its energy and its life from our brain. Now, if you look at a child's brain, suddenly it's a lot easier to see how it connects back to the father, obviously talking personality and wisdom and levels of intelligence and all of the ways that a son is similar, or a child is similar to their parents. So because every single part of the body, down to the last toenail, connects back to the brain, right? What makes the toenail grow? The child's brain. The child's brain, the connection between the child's brain and the parent's brain is a lot more apparent and a lot more clear. Now, what does that mean for us? Right? If we want to be self-deprecating for a second, we are not the tzaddik of the generation. If we had to put ourselves on a spectrum, we would probably put our souls a lot closer to toenail than to brain. And what I mean by that is that if we think about our life, our soul, how strong is it? How clear is it that my soul is a direct piece of God? For most of my life, it's covered up. Right? For most of my life, my godly soul, although I know at its essence, of course, it's still connected to God, but that's not the reality that it experiences. If I were to want to compare it, I'd put a lot closer to the toenails version of the Father's essence than to the brain. And yet, in every single generation, we might be the toenails, we might be the bottom of the barrel, but in every single generation we have tzaddikim. We have holy and righteous sages that they are more like the brain in the sense that their reality, it's a lot clearer that they are an essence of God. And I want to make this very clear because this is where some people get messed up. That when we say that we can connect to God through the righteous people of our generation, we don't, God forbid, mean that we need them and we can't form our own connection. Of course we could. And if you, right, just like the toenail, if you do a DNA test on the toenail, it's connected back to the Father. We're talking about in practical day-to-day life. How do we connect to God? So I can try to go it alone, but that's going to be a real uphill battle. It's going to be a real struggle for me to connect directly to God. However, if I follow the teachings and I follow the inspiration and I follow the tzaddikim of my generation, the holy, righteous, inspiring people of my generation, that will easily connect me back. And it's an easy, clear way. Because why? Because for them, their reality is a lot clearer that they are a piece of God. And so by connecting to them through that, I can make that my reality as well.
How do we know them?
So usually it's very clear. When we talk about these levels of tzaddikim, it's very clear. We're talking about the leaders of the generation. We're talking about people like the Rabbeim, the Rebbis, the Torah scholars, the inspirers of the masses. And to the Rebbe, going back in the 60s, gave a very beautiful analogy for this concept. If we imagine godliness as electricity, every single electrical appliance could connect to the grid, right? Every single electrical, if you have a lamp, how do you connect your lamp to electricity? So if you're really tinkering and you really want to give yourself a nasty shock, you could plug it directly into the wiring of your house. If you know what you're doing, it's called hardwiring, and many things that we do, right? We wire it directly into the wires. But there's a much easier solution, and that is you put on a plug and you plug it into the socket. Now, is the lamp connected directly to electricity? Yes. It's connected the exact same way. It is plugged in by itself. But what facilitates that relationship, what makes it easier, is if you take something that's already hardwired in, right? The outlet in your wall is already wired into the electricity of your house. If you take a plug and you just plug it into the outlet, it's infinitely times easier to make that connection. And that is also our connection to God. Of course, we all have our own connection because our soul at its essence is a piece of God, and that's true for every one of us. But some people experience that more readily and more obviously than others. And therefore, to make our life easier, God gave us tzaddikim, God gave us Torah scholars, God gave us inspirers to help us make that connection. And in fact, the Torah itself, the sages, the tradition, the oral Torah, tells us this about a very interesting verse. This is at the bottom of page 47. Ubezeh yuvon maimer azal. With this analogy, a teaching of our sages takes on a new meaning. Ala pasuk l'dafka bay. The Torah instructs us to bond with Him, with God. The sages ask, how is it possible to bond with God? Page 48. They explain that when someone bonds with a Torah sage, the Torah considers that person to be indeed bound up with God. When we connect to the Torah sages, to the tzaddikim of our generation, that causes us to connect much easier and much smoother back to God Himself. Continuing on page 48.
Is there any way to connect to God with non-Jewish wise people?
The answer is yes. And we're going to have this question a lot because throughout our discussion, we're going to be talking about Jewish people specifically. Most of what we say will apply to non-Jewish people as well, because at its core, we're all humans and we all have the same general makeup. Of course, the Jewish people have a special soul, and we have our godly soul, which connects us more directly. But at its core, every person is a creation of God, and every person was made in the image of God. And we all have that connection. For Jewish people, it works a little bit differently. And as the Tanya is talking to Jewish people, that's going to be our focus.
Who's getting in more trouble going outside the Jewish people.
Exactly. It gets a little bit more complicated as we change. But at its core, everything we say applies to all humans, even if the systems are a little bit differently. Continuing on page 48. Now that we have a picture of the organic network of the souls, this teaching is understood in an entirely new light. Bonding with Torah sages enables the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the simple people to connect with their own core divine identity, uniting them with the primal essence, originating the higher wisdom. And since He and their wisdom are one, for He is the mind that knows, in that union with His wisdom, they are bound up with God. And so, following that logic, the easiest and smoothest way to connect to God, just like the easiest way to get your lamp connected to electricity is to plug it into the wall socket, the easiest way for us to connect to God is to connect to the tzaddikim with that generation. Now, what about those that don't? What about those that don't have an active relationship with the tzaddik of their generation? What about those who not only don't have an active relationship, what about those who actively rebel and cause issues for the tzaddikim of their relationship, of their generation? How does that work? If the way that we plug into the socket is to connect to those righteous people in every generation, what about those that don't? What about those that actively rebel? So on page 49, as for those who deliberately rebel against the Torah sages, as for those who deliberately rebel against the Torah sages, they necessarily remain bonded to them, as it's integral to their existence as a Jew. It is only that the essential life energy of their nefesh, ruach, neshama enters subliminally through the backside of the nefesh, ruach, neshama of the Torah sages. This is a Kabbalistical concept of when you give someone something, there's two ways you can give it to them. You could hand it to them with a smile in front, and it's a nice, beautiful handoff. And sometimes, if you ever watch a teenager playing basketball, and they didn't do very well, and they have to hand off the ball to their team, how do they do it? They toss it behind their back, right? That's what we call bechinas acharayim, behind the back. The transactions still happen, the transfers still happen, but it's not with a smiling face, it's around the back, and that is as well how that works. The exact different ramifications of that we're not going to get into, but for our purpose, the important thing to remember is that every single Jewish person is connected directly to God. However, what facilitates and what makes that relationship easy and smooth and possible is through connecting to the tzaddikim of the generation. And if we actively pursue it, that's great. Even those who, God forbid, don't, or even worse, actively rebel against the tzaddikim, the righteous people of the generation, that relationship, that transfer still exists. It's just it just operates very differently. So far, we are getting a little bit more of an understanding of the godly soul. Our godly soul is a piece of God, and now whether or not we experience that personally, it is the essence and reality of the essence of our soul. The Alter Rebbe is going to finish off this chapter with one more question that someone who learned Zohar. Anyone learned Zohar around the table? If anyone who learned it well enough might think of a contradiction. Because in the Zohar, which is sort of the original text of Kabbalistical thought, where all of this is based on going, if you know how to trace it back, the Zohar says that the level of soul that somebody gets, what level of soul do you get? Well, that depends on the intentions and the purity of the parents at the time that they created the baby. And this is on top of page 50.
So that doesn't change?
So that's what we're going to ask. How does that work? If we're talking about essence, and we talk about, right, as we'll unpack over the next few paragraphs. Page 50. Even the circumstances of the soul's entry into life have no effect on the soul's essential quality. True, there is the teaching of the Zohar and the Zohar Chadash that the most important thing for a soul is that the parents sanctify themselves at the time of their union. They speak negatively of the children of the common people who don't do this.
What's the essence of this first line here? The circumstances of the soul's entry into life.
So this Tanya is a little bit of a complete product that you can read the English side, and it flows a lot more naturally than sort of the original text of the Tanya. That's the way they designed it specifically. So I'm presenting it as a question and an answer. They're presenting it as sort of the Alter Rebbe's clarifying, right? The Alter Rebbe says nothing can change the effect of the soul, not even the way that the soul came into this world. There's a contradiction because the Zohar says it does change depending on the way the parents conducted themselves. And then we're going to go on to answer the question. That paragraph is structured a little bit confusingly because of the way that we explained it. But the essence of that first line is saying that nothing, because our godly soul is an essential piece of God, nothing changes that essence. Not even what the Zohar talks about how the parents' conduct can change the soul. How does that work? We just said it's an essence and it never changes, and the same exact essence comes into every person. On the other hand, we see that the Zohar talks about how different people experience different souls because of, and what we're going to see how clear it is, but we already spoke about different levels, right? We already spoke about how as it comes through the world, it picks up different contaminants and it picks up different personalities depending on the different worlds. That's not even what we're talking about, because that we have no control over. That's our soul. Our soul's journey, that essence comes down to this world. It goes on its own journey depending on on the way that God wants it to come down. So what are we talking about? What can the parents control? These days, we're getting to the point where it's, sometime very soon, parents will be able to choose things, on a drop-down menu. What color eyes, what color hair, right? We're getting to that point of DNA editing. How does that work with the soul, right? So we see that the Zohar says that the parents have some control. Depending on how the parents conduct themselves at the time when they make the baby, that's a completely different child. And therefore the Zohar says, unfortunately, children of simple or of common people who don't know about this, they're at a loss. They enter the world at a loss because their parents didn't know to sanctify themselves. So the Alter Rebbe explains over there, when we talk about that difference, we're not talking about the soul itself.
So are you saying our soul in this world has been in the other worlds?
Yes.
And has made its way down to us?
At its essence, at its core, right? Because we're delving deep into the heart of the onion of our soul, right? We're going straight to the core. It's an essential piece of God. I don't feel that essential piece of God within me. Why not? Because there's lots and lots of contaminants and layers and covering up that the soul develops as it comes down through the worlds. So now the Alter Rebbe explains on the bottom of page 50. That's not talking about the soul herself. It's speaking about her clothing, because there's no nefesh, ruach, and neshama that doesn't have clothing. That clothing comes from the nefesh of the father and mother's core essence. So, what are we talking about? Where do we suddenly start talking about wardrobe? The soul is a godly being, right? As Len just pointed out, our soul that's within us comes from God. The question becomes, how does that soul interface with the world around it? How does the soul, we want to do a mitzvah, so we start off the class by saying when we do a mitzvah, we are embodying that soul. That's a huge leap, that our soul, and as I pointed out before as well, we don't call our animal soul the physical soul because it's not physical. How do our souls, both animal and physical, interface with the world around them? Through what's called the levushim, through the garments. Just like our garments allow us to interface with the public around us, and if we don't have clothing and we try to enter the public, we're in trouble. And even more specifically, specific jobs require certain outfits, and somebody who works as a deep sea diver needs a certain outfit, and someone who works as a construction worker, our jobs and our way that we interact and the way we build the world around us require certain garments. That is also loosely how the soul works as well. The soul has different mechanisms that it interacts with the world around it. And we're going to discuss those mechanisms at length in the following chapters. But for now, what we have to know is that the soul, we have no control over the souls of our children. What we have control, what we could give them a leg up in the world, is by giving them a good set of work jeans, by giving them a good set of levushim, of garments, the garments that allow them to interact with the world. The parents, through acting properly, can give their children that proper set of garments. Continuing on page 51, explaining this concept of the garments. Kol mitzvah ase, kol hamitzvah she'aseh, hakol ayidei oseh halavush, v'filu hashefa she'neis lemin shemayim, hakol ayidei lavush zeh. Every mitzvah that she does is through the interface of this clothing. Even the flow of life given from above has to come through this clothing. Everything that the soul receives or does in this world has to go through these clothing, as we'll discuss at length. And so circling back to the parent's role, if the parents sanctify themselves at the time of union, they will elicit sanctified clothing for their child's soul. The quality of this clothing is crucial for the soul. Even if she is a great soul, she still requires the sanctification of the father and mother at the time of their union. But with a big caveat that this is only talking about the garments, not the soul itself. But the quality of the soul itself is not affected by the parents. Indeed, sometimes the soul of an inestimably great human being comes to the child of a despicable and lowly person. Anyone have an example for that? Someone we know in our history, a great and lofty person that came in, that his father was a pretty horrible person? Abraham. The first Jew, the one who discovered God, who was his father? Terach, an idol merchant. As we continue on page 52, Commissioner Kosev Arizal, Zocher Levacha, V'kolzeb, L'kutei Torah, Parshas Vayera, B'taimei Mitzvahs, Parshas Bereshis. All the above is written by the Arizal in L'kutei Torah, Parshas Vayera. Parshas Vayera is the parsha that talks about Avram, right? That's where sort of where we talk about Avram's life. And so in L'kutei Torah over there, it explains this concept that ultimately the child's spiritual standing, the child's soul, is beyond the control of the parents. What is our soul? What is our godly soul? Our godly soul, at its core, at its essence, is a piece of God. And then, whatever contaminants, and whatever distractions, and whatever personalities it picked up in its journey through the worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. So right now, at the end of chapter 2, again, the second half, most of what we covered today is sort of side questions that you might have. The Alter Rebbe introduced us to this fundamental concept that our soul is at its essence a piece of God. And when we say a piece of God, we're talking about an essential piece of God's wisdom, which God and His wisdom are one. So our soul is, at its essence, at its core, a piece of God.
What causes it to pick up these?
So that's ultimately the journey of the soul. If every soul came down here perfectly, then there'd be nothing for us to do. As we'll see, the purpose is to flex that muscle and to peel away those contaminants and to make that our soul, as distracted as it is, and as muffled as it is, and as contaminated as it is, our job is to still break that through and utilize our godly soul as much as possible. This doctrine, this idea of the two souls, is going to be the fundamental understanding and guide as we continue through Tanya. However, souls don't do much for me. How does my soul act? How does it function? How does it affect the world around me? How does my soul affect me? And so to explain that now, we're in chapter 3, so we're skipping to page 61. I'm sorry, David, I didn't get a chance to print a more longer consolidated booklet. But in the chapter 3 booklet, we are talking about the faculties of the soul. And when we talk about these faculties, we're going to be flipping back and forth between our emotional attributes, right, the things that make us, the emotions that we can feel, and the way that our brain processes information, and those emotional and intellectual faculties. I'm going to use the word faculties. I know that it's not a word that we use in conversation, but it's a good word to sort of the way that we function in the world, the way that we interact with the world, as we'll see, is through these faculties. And right now we're going to explain these ideas in the godly soul, the intellectual faculties, and then the emotional faculties, and then we'll circle back and we'll say that they mirror the godly soul and the non-godly soul. The important thing to remember is that the godly soul, at its essence, at its core, what does it want? It wants godliness. It wants to connect. It comes down to this world with a mission and with a pull. And just like a flame is constantly striving to go up and striving to go beyond itself, that's why a flame flickers, because it wants to go back to its source. It wants to just leave the physical realm. Our soul wants to do the same thing. How does that actually work? We're about to find out. So on page 61 at the top, chapter 3, Perek Gimel, V'hinei kol bechinas u'madrega mishalish elu, nefesh, ruach, u'neshama, kulo mi-eser bechinas k'neged eser spheres elyonis sheneshtalshlu mehem. Now the divine soul, on each of her, there's 3 distinct levels of nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Again, we're referencing these ideas of that the soul itself is split up into these 3 sub-souls, right? And just because, to give the full picture, there are really 5 sub-souls. There's nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yichida. But these 3 sub-souls are the ones that are in our body, powering us on different levels, and we'll discuss that more at length later, so I don't want to get too bogged down in those details now. But each one of those 3 levels of nefesh, ruach, and neshama consists of 10 faculties corresponding to the 10 spheros of the higher divine world. And this is going to be important because
Are these in different worlds, or are they all?
They're all in our soul. In our soul, in our physical body, the ones that we experience as we're about to see. This is another place where our development and our operating system closely mirrors God. And right now we're going to explain it on the human side. But, again, for those that joined us for the world of Kabbalah, the same ideas exist within God as well, and whenever the Alter Rebbe references back to it, we'll explain how that works. But for now, these faculties are actually micro versions of these spheros, the outcome of a long process of descent through the chain of countless spiritual worlds. Right? In last chapter, we just said that our soul comes through those worlds. So in the worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, in those 4 worlds, each one of those worlds is comprised of these 10 attributes on the God side. Through that process of evolving through those worlds, our soul also develops those 10 attributes. If that was a little bit over, don't let that bog you down. Again, on the godly side, it's not so important to keep track of what it is. I will explain for context, especially when the Alter Rebbe does. But for our purposes, we're going to understand the way that the soul works. The soul wants to be inspired. The soul wants to connect to God. How does it do that?
What's the definition of Sephirot?
Sephiros, on the godly side, are the ways that God interacts and the way that God expresses himself. Right? And as we start naming them, if you'd like, I can sort of mirror back and forth. Those 10 Sephiros, those 10 Sephiros are divided into 2 categories. 3 are called mothers, and 7 are called doubles. Now, as for why they're called mothers and doubles, so mothers is pretty clear, because they are the intellectual faculties, which we're calling mothers. They are what give birth to our emotional attributes. Why the other ones are called doubles is a pretty Kabbalistical idea, and you can look at the bottom of the page in that shaded box for some more context, but we're not going to go into that now. But the idea is that in our body, our 10 faculties, which the top 3 are the intellectual faculties, and the bottom 7, which are the emotional, the intellectual ones are what give birth to the emotional ones, which is actually what defines us as human beings. Right? There's a famous thing about the difference between the anatomy of a human and an animal. Humans stand upright. Why? Because for us, our intellect, at least in theory, should overpower our emotions. And our intellect is what leads to the emotions. That is the way we were designed as humans, to have that cause and effect, that we should. It happens the other way also, and that's a problem when it happens that way, because then our intellect is being controlled by our emotions, and that's not how it's supposed to be. In a human, our intellect is above our emotion. Our brain is higher than our heart. In an animal, it's equal. In fact, most of the time the animal's head is down, so the intellect is actually lower than the emotion. But the difference of that anatomy is because the animal world doesn't have this ability. They don't have the ability to logically figure out, what they should do. What usually happens is, even of very smart animals, they're using the brain to get what their heart wants. Right? An animal doesn't use its heart, doesn't develop emotion, and doesn't develop love and fear the same way we do. It has its emotions, and that leads its brain to figure out how to get. Right? The heart wants to eat, and so the brain goes and finds a fresh patch of grass, etc., etc. So that is what makes us human, that we have the 7 emotional attributes and faculties, which again, we're throwing these words around, we're going to explain more in depth what these are, but they are controlled and they are birthed by the 3 intellectual attributes. Perush, Chachma, Bina, Das. The 3 mothers are Chachma, which is wisdom or conception, Bina, which is understanding or comprehension, and Das, which is knowing, consciousness, and bonding. We're going to explain these at length. The Shivas Yimei Binyan, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, and the seven other attributes are Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. You may recognize those terms if you count Sefirat HaOmer. Right? We go through those different attributes. Those are the emotional attributes that we each have. Right? Chesed, benevolence, Gevura, might, Tiferet, beauty, and 4 more, which we're not going to really touch on because they are subsections of the other 3. Right, but for right now, we are going to be focusing on the human body. Those 10 Sephiros, which we just spoke about, those are on the godly realm. That God has those 10 Sephirot, those 10 attributes, so when God interacts with the world, it's through one of those 10 ways. The Chen ben Nefesh Adam, continuing on page 62. As it is above, so too in the divine soul within a human being, the 10 faculties of the soul are divided into 2 categories, intelligence and emotion. Intelligence comprises Chachma, Bina, and Das. The Hamides Hein, Avas Hashem, Upachti V'Rasei L'Farei, the emotion of our love of God, awe and reverence towards Him, and a drive to glorify and praise Him, as well as others along the same line. And we'll just finish off on page 62 before we give some explanation. Chachma, Bina, Das, Nikra, Imais, Umakar Lemides, Kamides Heim Toldi Chachma, Bina, Das. Chachma, Bina, and Das are called the mothers and the well springs of the emotion, because the emotions are the children of the mind. What are we talking about? Who's lost? Let's talk a little bit about how we develop emotions. right? So we have some emotions that we have naturally. And we're going to discuss that more when we talk about on the animal soul side of it. We have natural emotions that we love, as Rabbi Gordon from Southern California would say, we love 7-layer cake, and we hate to get hurt, right? Those are natural. What if we want to develop an emotion? What if there's someone that I want to get close to? Or what if I want to get close to God? What if I want to develop feelings for God? The Torah commands us, you shall love God and you shall fear God. And all the commentaries ask on that, how could the Torah command an emotion? An emotion we usually think is either something I feel or it isn't. Right? Anyone who's ever tried to set up a friendship between two young children, it's like, go play with them. So when they're really young, oh, you have toys and I have toys, let's play. When they're a little bit older, you say, go be friends with that kid. It doesn't usually work like that. Either I'm friends with him, either I like him or I don't. How can the Torah command us to have an emotion, whether it's love or awe, right? We're going to use the word fear. When we talk about fear of heaven, fear of God, we're not talking about we're scared of God, like that God is going to punish us. We're talking about a feeling of awe, of trepidation, that God is so great, and who am I compared to God? That feeling of awesome and trepidation. How do I develop those feelings?
Action.
So the outcome is action, and until we have those feelings, we definitely should have the action as well. But Tanya will explain that those feelings are developed through the intellectual process. In short, that intellectual process is chachma. Chachma is that initial flash of inspiration. In fact, chachma is so abstract and such a flash that sometimes you don't even know what it is. Right? And I'll leave for a second the idea of developing these into emotions. We'll circle back to that. But let's say you have a problem. You have something, you have to deal with a problem at work, a problem with someone that you know, there's an issue. And you don't know how to deal with it. And you're thinking long and hard. Suddenly you get that flash of something, of wait a second, I have it. What is it? You don't know. And if someone disturbs you at that second, it's gone and you'll spend the rest of the day trying to get that moment back. That initial flash of inspiration is chachma. That initial lightning bolt of here's an idea. What do you do with that idea? Then you have bina. Bina is the process that extrapolates and understands fully and says, I have this issue at work that client doesn't want to buy from me. And then you think about, I should set up a meeting and talk to this person, talk to that person. From that initial burst of inspiration, bina is the process of developing that idea and fleshing it out fully. However, as much as you can have that inspiration and you can flesh out an idea, if you don't apply it to yourself, if you don't make it meaningful to yourself, it's just a hypothetical. There's the famous story, I believe it's a real story, that in the old Russian outback, in the old Russian towns, most people weren't literate. They wanted their kids to grow up as nice, good, solid Jews, and so they would hire a malamed, a traveling teacher who would come, spend a few months, and teach their children, how to do the prayers and how to... The story goes that one time there was a farmer out in the middle of nowhere, and he got a letter in the mail. And he doesn't know how to read. But thank God, he has a malamed, he has his children's teacher is there, and so he brings the teacher the letter, and he says, can you tell me what this says? And the guy starts reading, and he says, turns out that Chaim Yankel in the city of Vitebsk passed away. Suddenly, the farmer falls faint. When they wake him up, he says, what happened? He says, that's my father. That's my father. So they asked the malamed, they asked the teacher, I don't understand. You were one level closer to the news. You actually read it. The letter probably contained more details. It was maybe a little more graphic. You knew it firsthand, or whatever, secondhand. Why did the farmer who heard it third hand, why was he so much more affected than you? He said, of course I wasn't affected. For me, it's a hypothetical, it's some person. For him, it's personal. And that is the process of das. You can have all the intellectual and all the hypotheticals in your brain. If you don't make it personal to you, it won't have an effect on your emotion. So taking that concept and connecting it to our understanding of God, when we sit and we meditate and we want to build a connection to God, we have that initial flash, that initial something that we want to connect. Then we have bina, that we sit and we extrapolate and we take that tiny spot of inspiration and we develop it and we fully understand as much as we could about godliness and about God. And why should I care about God? Well, God gives me things, God helps me, God blesses me, all of those things. But if that remains in the hypothetical, it doesn't accomplish anything. We need that third step as well. We need that das. We need to make it real. We need to make it personal and then it will have an effect and lead to the birth of the emotions that come later. We'll read that inside at the bottom of page 62. Ubeir her inyan. This is how the mind gives birth to emotion. This entire process, and some more details you'll find on page 63. You have that big chart that labels things and it also shows you the process of how it works. And you see on the left side, these are the way that they are in the Sephiros, in God. And on the right side, this is the way it is in the soul. Again, we're going to be focusing on the soul side of it because that is the purpose of Tanya. I'm not going to be going through it in more detail, and after we're done, you can go back and look at that diagram and follow along to what we were just talking about. On page 64.
It's pretty well accepted the way it's written here,
yes.
or they're different.
Yes. Generally speaking, that diagram is how it is, and if you've ever seen the Kabbalistical diagrams, you have those interconnecting triangles. That's what you have here as well. You have the triangle. You have 3 sets of triangles, and then the bottom malchus. It's a little bit, just for the sake of our discussion, it's a little bit different here. But again, you have the intellectual attributes on top, the main emotional attributes on the bottom, and then the sub-emotional attributes on the very bottom, which we'll explain when we get to that point. On page 64, Kihine haseichel shebenefesh hamaskeles shehu maskil kol davar nikra b'shem chachma koyach ma. The intelligence of the divine soul's mind, the faculty that enables her to conceive any idea, is called chachma, which is comprised of koyach ma, 2 words, koyach ma. Koyach means potential, ma means what? Referring to something undefined beyond knowing. You know, but you don't know what you know. There's something there, but it's still very, very intangible and very hard to follow. Page 65. Ukashamaitzi koyche alapayel. Umizbeinim besichle lahavin davar lashuli lamkoi b'derech eze davar chachma hamuskal besichle nikrabina. You now have some packet of chachma from your mind. The next step is when you make this potential real. You contemplate it and you try to understand something of it thoroughly and deeply. This is called bina. V'hein of v'eim hamelides avas Hashem v'yirasei b'pachte. These two, chachma and bina, are the father and mother that give birth to emotion, the love of God, awe of Him, and palpable reverence for Him. Right? When I want to have a fear for God, if I don't understand anything about God, if I don't know, why should I care about God? I can't develop fear and I can't develop love because I don't understand anything about it. How do I develop feelings for God? By having that first initial flash of inspiration. Right? I'm sitting and I'm meditating, I'm trying to grasp something, and I have that first spark, and then I develop that fully, which in our conversation, what does that mean, develop it fully? I sit and I contemplate. Let's say I want to develop a love of God. How do you develop a love of God? How do you develop a love for something you've never seen and you've never experienced? Well, think about what you have experienced. Think about all the amazing blessings that God has given us. And you think about how that's all coming from God. And you think about how God stops everything to make sure that we have what we need, etc., etc. When we take the time to do that meditation, with the initial flash of chachma, and the main part, which is bina, fully developing it, that is how I develop emotion. And that is the father and mother that give birth to the emotion. How does that process happen? Through arguably the most vital step on page 66. It's going to go through these ideas. Sorry, we're not at the most vital step. He's explaining the mechanism, page 66. Ki haseichel shebenefesh hamaskelas ki shezbeinemu mamik moed b'duas Hashem ein sei echu memali kolam v'sevkolam v'kulakam v'kolachshiv. It starts when your divine soul's mind engages in a very deep contemplation of God's greatness, how He pervades all worlds, how He transcends all worlds, or where everything might as well be nothing relative to Him. Think about the greatness of God for a second. And for those that have done the morning prayers, we spend a lot of time doing this. We spend so much time in the verses of praise, the Psukkah de Zimra, before we get to the Shema and to the blessings of the Shema. We spend a lot of time saying verses of Tehillim. If you read the English of those verses, most of it is talking about God's greatness. All the things that God does, why should you praise God? If you think about why are we praising God? All the things He accomplishes, all the things He's done for us. And you start taking those ideas and you really think and you meditate about them. And you continue the process of thinking about how great God is. God is everywhere. God is nowhere. God created everything. God is in everything. Continue on page 66. Neidl v'nes midas yiras haremimos b'meichei u'b'machshavtei liyera u'lizbeishis migdulasi yisbarich she'ein la sefer sachlis. If you think about how great God is, right? Remember I was saying that fear of God is not, we don't think about how God's going to punish us. We think about how great and how awesome God is. If you think about how awesome God is, you know what emotion you'll start feeling? Awe. God is so amazing and incredible and created everything. Who am I compared to God? Who am I? I start to feel a sense of loss, a sense of wonder when faced with godliness. How do we develop that feeling? Well, if you think about how great God is, you'll develop that feeling of awe.
Now, I've read that if you don't believe in God, God would rather you still do everything, still do the rituals, because if your actions are always in that direction, you will eventually change your feelings.
Yes, absolutely. And the idea of fake it till you make it is a real thing in Judaism. And we don't say, wait until you really feel all these emotions fully before we develop. And because you're absolutely right. As we develop, as we do things, we'll get closer to God. How does that work? Why does that work? If I put on tefillin, not me, but if someone doesn't believe in God and puts on tefillin every day, why does that refine them? Why does that make them better? So I'll give you a hint that we'll talk about at length, that every time you put on tefillin, you're strengthening, you're working out your godly soul. And as the godly soul gets stronger and stronger, these natural feelings that it naturally believes in God, it naturally wants to connect to God, those feelings will become stronger and stronger. So you're absolutely right in the process that if someone doesn't have these feelings, if someone is so far behind the curve, they don't even want to develop these feelings, they don't even want to meditate, we still tell them, do it. Whether you believe it or not, do what you got to do because you're strengthening your godly soul, and that process will work itself out. But here we're talking about somebody wants to develop these feelings. Somebody doesn't just want to do it because, peer pressure or because that's what they know they, in theory, should be doing. They want to really develop these feelings of love and fear for God. This is how you do it. You want to develop a sense of awe and a sense of fear? Think about how great God is. Upachad Hashem, believe a palpable feel of God begins to throb in your heart. What happens when you're in awe of God? What happens when you think of how awesome and amazing God is? That feeling also starts to lead to, you want to connect to Him. If you have the opportunity to connect to the most amazing person you ever met, the more you think about how amazing that person is, the more you want to connect to them, the more you want to get to know them. Continuing in the middle of page 66, and then your heart ignites in love as fierce as a flaming fire, yearning, desiring, longing, a soul longing for the greatness of the infinite. This is the meaning of a soul swooning out of love. Our soul, if we compare it to the example of the candle that I brought earlier, right? The godly soul naturally wants to go beyond the physical realm and connect to God. That is possible for us to feel as well. If we're fully feeling the emotions of the godly soul, which, right now we're just talking about one side of the equation. Problem is that every time we try to feel that, we have the other side, which we'll discuss in the coming chapters. But if we feel that emotion, our physical body, our physical heart wants to connect to God. Because when our physical body is manifesting the operating system of the godly soul, it wants to do what the godly soul wants to do. And the godly soul wants to just connect to God. Everything else it doesn't care about. It doesn't care about the physical world. And that's actually, you can read in the shaded box on the bottom, that's a problem. Because that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to bring down God into this world, not leave this world to connect to God. But that idea of close hanefesh, of a swooning soul, that it just wants to connect and nothing else matters, how do you develop that feeling? By fully internalizing and by fully meditating and by fully realizing God's greatness. As it is written, my soul yearns, she even zooms to the courtyard of God, my heart and flesh sing to the God of life. As it is written, my soul thirsts for God, the living God. Oh, when will I come to appear before God? Those are the emotions that we start to feel and we start to experience when we meditate and fully think about God's greatness. But here comes the most important part. If we think about it as a hypothetical, nothing makes a difference. What we have to do is we have to make it real. We have to make it personal. We have to make it that it's not a hypothetical God, it's my God. It's not a hypothetical opportunity to connect to God, it's my opportunity to connect to God. And this is on page 68. This is the final step. V'hadas. We've described Chachma and Bina. As for das, which we've called knowing, humilashon v'adam yada and chava. This is the term that the Torah uses to describe the first intimate union, and Adam knew Eve. Right? That's the euphemism that the Torah uses for Adam and Eve becoming intimate, was Adam knew Eve. Why that? Because when we talk about knowledge, when we talk about das on this level, we're talking about an intimate relationship. It's not hypothetical, it's personal, it's deep, and it's real. Accordingly, das is not how you accumulate knowledge, but how you connect and identify with that knowledge. To achieve das, you need to fasten your mind in a contemplation with a very firm and strong knot. Intensely fixing your thoughts upon the greatness of the infinite God, you don't let your mind wander. Ki, af mishu chacham v'navain, b'gdulas ein seif baruch hu, hine im lo yiskasher daite v'yiska machshavte b'chezek hasmada lo yelid b'nafshe yira v'ava amitis. This connection through intense focus is critical. You could be wise and understanding in the greatness of the infinite, but if you don't fixate your mind and focus your thoughts firmly and persistently in your contemplation of that wisdom and understanding, your soul won't give birth to genuine awe and love. Ki im dimyon shava, without das, whatever emotions you achieve are but vain delusions. V'al kain hadas ukim hamidus v'chayusan v'hu kelel chesed ugvura perish ava. This is why das is considered one of the parents of emotion. Das ensures that your thoughts will give birth to viable, authentic love and awe. It is the sustaining power and lifeline of those emotions and their respective branches. Without das itself, chesed and gvura, the emotions of love and awe, were already present. Without das itself, chesed and gvura, the emotions of love, are already present in a subtle, cerebral way. In our life, and as we strive to connect to God, and as we'll continue learning in the coming chapters of Tanya, the way that we do this and the way we accomplish it, it all comes back to this 3-step program. Our godly soul wants to connect to God. That's that initial flash of chachma. It wants something. It knows that there's something out there for it to connect to. How does that develop? How does it make that real? It takes that chachma and turns it into bina. And when we sit and we meditate, whether during prayer or before prayer or whenever it is, and we utilize the opportunity to connect to God, to think about God, and to think about God's greatness. And there's a spectrum here. We talk about, to develop awe and love, we think about 2 different things. On one hand, we think about how great and awesome God is. On the other hand, we think about how we have the opportunity. And God, we're going to talk about the idea that God leaves the upper worlds and lower worlds, and He wants to connect to us. When we sit down to pray, God is sitting there listening to us. God, that great, awesome, incredible God that we're talking about, is sitting here waiting to speak to me, and waiting to hear what I have to say, and what I want to learn in Torah, and I'm praying. When we think about that, and we not only think about it, we make it real to us, the emotions that come out of that are real, authentic, long-lasting emotions of love and fear, and want to connect, and want to make God's name last forever, as the different 7 emotional attributes are, which we will continue to explain in the coming chapters. And so, for right now, in the end of chapter 3, we have a fuller understanding of, we know we have a natural soul, we know we have an animal soul, we have a natural soul, we have a godly soul. The godly soul is the essence of God. Now, you might not experience reality that way because of different contaminants, but our godly soul is, at its core, an essence of God. And now we're starting to discuss how those souls interact with the world. So starting on the positive side with the godly soul, how does the godly soul empower our body? It makes our brain think about how great God is. It makes our heart develop emotions based on that understanding. And when we act and when we live those emotions, we are living the reality of the godly soul. God willing, we'll continue next week.